They lowered a stranger into my husband's grave and folded a flag into my hands. I clawed at the cold marble until my nails split and sobbed his name into the dirt. 7 months I swallowed that grief whole. I learned to cook for one. I learned to sleep in the center of the bed instead of the edge. I answered, "How are you holding up?" with a brave little smile, and everyone told me I was strong. Then a soft cough in the canned goods aisle ripped me open. I turned, and 3 shelves down stood a man frowning at the price of coffee, and I knew that cough the way I knew how to breathe. He was alive. My husband was alive. And the flag they had put in my hands was folded over a lie. My name is Kathleen Boyd. I am 63 years old, and for 40 years I worked as a hospice nurse. That work teaches you things most people never learn, and it teaches them to you slowly, one bedside at a time, until they become part of the way you see the world. It teaches you what a body looks like when the life has gone out of it. It teaches you the exact weight of a hand that will never squeeze back. It teaches you that death is not a rumor or a fear, it is a plain fact. You can read on skin and in breath and in the color of a person's lips. I sat beside hundreds of people at the very end of their lives. I closed their eyes with my own fingers. I signed the papers that made their deaths official. I know death the way a carpenter knows wood by the grain and the weight and the feel of it under my hands. So when they told me my husband Walter had died in a car fire on a county road, I believed them. I believed them because I had spent my whole life believing in the reality of death, and because I had no reason on earth to imagine that the people I loved most were lying to my face. We were married 41 years. 41 years of the same chipped coffee mug on the counter every single morning. 41 years of him reading the newspaper out loud whenever something in it made him angry, which was often because Walter was a man who took the state of the world personally. 41 years of his cough, that small dry cough he always gave right before he complained about anything at all, as if he needed to clear the road before the words could come out. I could have picked that cough out of a crowd of 1,000 men. I did pick it out. That is how this whole thing started, with a cough in a grocery store, the smallest sound in the world. The funeral is the part I go back to now, though I did not know then that I was mourning a lie. It was a cold, gray morning in the churchyard, the kind of morning where the sky sits low and the grass is stiff with frost. Walter had served in the army as a young man long before I ever knew him, and so there was an honor guard at the graveside. 3 soldiers in dress uniform I had never met in my life. They folded the flag into a tight triangle with slow and practiced hands, and one of them knelt in front of me and placed it in my palms and thanked me for my husband's service. I held that flag against my chest as if it were a living thing, and I believed every word of the ceremony down to my bones. My neighbors came in their dark coats. The men from Boyd Freight came in their good shirts, holding their hats against their stomachs, shifting their weight, because they were not men who were comfortable in churchyards. And Bradley stood beside me the entire time with his hand resting on my shoulder, and I remember thinking through the fog of it all, at least I still have my son. I leaned on that thought for 7 months. I did not yet know it was the emptiest thing in that whole cold churchyard. There was one small moment at the graveside that I did not understand until much later, and even at the time it left a splinter in me that I could not work out. One of the older drivers from Boyd Freight, a heavy-set man named Roy Dillard, who had worked for Walter for close to 20 years, came toward me as the crowd began to break apart. He had his hat crushed in both hands, and his eyes were wet, and there was something urgent in the way he moved, as if he had a thing to tell me that could not wait. He got within a few feet of me and opened his mouth, and then Bradley stepped smoothly between us. He put an arm around Roy's shoulders and turned him gently away, and walked him off toward the line of cars, talking low the whole time. I thought nothing of it. I thought my son was sparing me one more weeping man on the worst day of my life. I did not know that Roy Dillard had spent 30 years driving those trucks and keeping those logs, and that he had noticed things about the money and the routes that did not add up, and that he had come to the graveside, not to grieve, but to warn me. I would not learn any of that for a long time. But some part of me kept that image, my son, steering an old driver away from me by the shoulders, and it waited quietly in the dark until I was ready to see it for what it was. The closed casket did not trouble me at the time, and that is the cruelest part of the whole thing. Bradley had told me the fire was very bad. He had told me gently with his hand over mine at the kitchen table that it would be a kindness to myself not to look. And I, of all the people in that county, agreed to be spared. I had seen more damaged bodies in 40 years than any funeral director for 100 miles. I knew exactly what fire does to a person, and I knew that whatever was left of Walter was not something I needed carved into my memory. So when my son said, "Do not look," I nodded and I thanked him for protecting me, and I let them lower a sealed box into the ground. That is the trap they built, and they built it out of my own knowledge. They knew I would never demand to see the body because they knew I already understood what fire does. My whole life of learning was the very lock they turned against me. So I stood there in my good black coat, and I wept for a man who was 2 towns over that very morning alive and unhurt, probably teaching a child to ride a bicycle or complaining about the price of something in a store. Let me tell you what those 7 months were, because you cannot understand what happened in that grocery store unless you understand the shape of the grief that came before it. 7 months of waking every morning to the silence on his side of the bed, a silence so complete it had a weight to it. 7 months of reaching for the phone to tell him some small thing, a bird on the feeder, a story on the news before the memory came down on me like a wall, and I remembered there was no one to call. 7 months of learning to cook for one, which is a strange and lonely arithmetic having, every recipe throwing out the food that spoiled because there was no one to finish it. 7 months of learning to sleep in the center of the bed, instead of clinging to my own edge of answering the door with a face I arranged carefully before I opened it, of telling my friends I was doing fine, doing better taking it one day at a time. People told me I was strong. They said it the way people say it, meaning it kindly, and I let them believe it. What they did not know was that strength was the only thing I had left, and that I was rationing it the way you ration water in a drought, a sip at a time, never knowing how long the drought would last. I want you to understand that I was a good widow. I did everything right. I grieved him honestly and completely. I did not shortchange that man a single tear. And that is why what I found later burned in me the way it did, because every one of those tears had been extracted from me, under false pretenses, wrung out of me by people who knew the whole time that the man I was crying for was sitting down to dinner in a pale green house on the other side of the county. It was a Tuesday. I remember that it was a Tuesday because I had put off the shopping since the weekend, and my refrigerator had finally emptied itself down to a jar of pickles and a carton of milk that had turned. Grief does not care that your refrigerator is empty. It does not excuse you from the small mechanical business of staying alive. So I drove to the grocery store 2 towns over the larger one, because I had reached the point where I could not stand to shop in my own town anymore, where every aisle held someone who would tilt their head and lower their voice and ask me how I was holding up. 2 towns over, I was nobody. 2 towns over, I could push a cart down an aisle and be left alone with my thoughts, which were the only company I kept those days. I was standing in this canned goods aisle, staring at rows of beans and soup, thinking how strange it was that the world kept spinning while mine had stopped dead. The store was bright and ordinary. A tinny song played over the speakers. Somewhere a child was fussing and a mother was hushing it. I reached for a jar of tomato sauce, the kind Walter liked out of a habit I had not yet unlearned, and my hand was already closing around the cool glass when I heard it. A soft cough. Just a small dry cough 3 shelves down. And then low in a mutter meant for no one a complaint about the price of coffee. My hand froze in the air. I did not decide to freeze it. My body simply stopped the way a deer stops in a field when something is wrong before the mind has caught up to the ears, because my body knew before my mind would allow it. I had lived beside that cough for 41 years. I had heard it drift from the kitchen 1,000 mornings. I had heard it in the dark beside me in bed. My mind, which is a reasonable and orderly thing, said it could not be, because my mind had watched him buried. But my body did not consult my mind. My body turned me around, and 3 shelves down stood a man holding a shopping basket, reading a label, frowning at it, the way Walter frowned at anything that cost more than he thought it should. The same broad shoulders hunched a little more now than I remembered. The same silver hair that never lay flat no matter what he did to it. The same scar above his right eyebrow, thin and pale from a ladder fall he had laughed about for years, a fall that had frightened me half to death at the time and become a family joke ever after. The man I buried. The man whose name was carved into the stone in the churchyard where I had knelt that very week, standing in a grocery store alive, squinting at the price of coffee. I need to tell you exactly what happened in my body in that aisle, because I have gone back to that moment 1,000 times since turning it over, testing it, and it has never once failed the test. My mind said it could not be him. My mind is a reasonable thing, and it had good reasons. It had a funeral and a casket and a death certificate. But my body had lived beside that man for 41 years, and it knew the set of those shoulders and the tilt of that head, the way it knew how to breathe without thinking, without permission. My knees went soft under me. The lights overhead seemed to hum louder. The jar of sauce was cold and slick in my hand, and I realized I could no longer feel my own fingers wrapped around it. And here is the thing that saved me, the thing that made me different from the poor grieving woman the other shoppers thought they were watching. I did not run at him. I did not scream. 40 years at the bedside had built something into me that even shock could not knock loose. I stood very still and I looked at him the way I had looked at 10,000 patients wheeled onto my ward, not with my heart, with my eyes. I catalogued him the way I would chart a stranger. Height, posture, the way he shifted his weight onto his left hip because his right knee had ached for years. The way he held the can up close to his face to read the small print because he was too vain to wear his reading glasses in public. And every single thing I saw was Walter. Not a man who resembled Walter. Not a brother or a cousin or a coincidence. Walter. And a nurse does not argue with what is plainly in front of her. The jar slipped out of my numb fingers. It shattered across the white tile and red sauce spread out around my shoes like something bleeding out onto the floor. People gasped and stepped back. A young man in a store apron came hurrying over asking if I was all right. Was I hurt? Careful, be careful of the glass. I did not answer him. I did not even hear him properly. My feet were already moving. Walter, I said. My voice cracked, coming out of my throat rusty from disuse because I had not said his name aloud to his face in 7 months. Walter, it is me. He turned. And for one terrible, hopeful second, I waited for his face to open the way it always had when he saw me across a room, that small lift at the corners of his eyes, the recognition, the coming home of it. Instead, he looked at me with polite confusion. The careful, pitying look you give a stranger who might be unwell, who might be about to make a scene you would rather not be part of. I am sorry, he said. I think you have me confused with someone else. Those words hurt more than the sight of him had. Confused. As if 41 years could be a case of mistaken identity. As if I had not memorized every line of that face in the dark, traced it with my fingers on 1,000 nights, watched it age year by year across 4 decades. No, I whispered. I stepped closer, glass crunching under my shoe. No, it is me, Kathleen, your wife. I took a step back. And that small movement, that single backward step, hurt me more than anything else in that whole bright, terrible aisle. Because Walter never stepped back from me. Not once in 41 years. Not in our worst fights, not when I was wrong and stubborn about it, not when he was. That man had never in his life backed away from me. And now he did. My name is Gordon Hale, he said. I am sorry. I do not know you. The voice was his. Deep, a little rough at the edges. The exact voice that had told me he loved me on 100 quiet nights. That had read the paper out loud in anger, that had said my name 10,000 ways across 41 years. I reached into my purse with shaking hands and I pulled up a photograph on my phone, one from his last birthday, the 2 of us on the porch, his arm around my shoulders, both of us squinting into the summer sun. I held the phone up in the space between us. Look at this, I said. This is us. This is our porch. You burned the steaks that day and blamed the grill. You remember. You have to remember. He glanced down at the screen, and for just a moment something moved behind his eyes. A flicker, a tightening along his jaw, a small muscle jumping under the skin. It was there, and then it was gone, smoothed over so fast that a person who did not know that face would have missed it entirely. But I knew that face. I had watched it lie before small social lies, and I knew exactly what it looked like when Walter was covering something. I have never seen that photograph in my life, he said gently, kindly, in the voice you use on The Fragile. You look like you are going through something very hard. And then he put his hand on my shoulder. That touch nearly broke me in half where I stood, because it was his hand. The same warmth, the same weight, the same spot he had always found when he wanted to calm me down, the exact place on my shoulder his palm had lived for 41 years. You should sit down, he said. Get yourself some water. But I was a nurse. And a nurse does not accept a face, and a nurse does not accept a name, and a nurse does not accept a soothing hand on her shoulder. A nurse checks the body. The body does not lie. Faces can be composed, and voices can be steadied, and names can be invented, but the body keeps its own honest record written in scar and bone, and I had spent 40 years learning to read it. Show me your fingers, I said. He frowned at that, but he raised his left hand the way you humor a person you have decided is not well. And there it was. The little finger that had healed crooked after he broke it at 15, fixing his mother's roof. The finger I had teased him about for 4 decades, the one I used to hook with my own in the dark. And below it, along the side of his wrist, I saw the pale, thin seam of an old surgical scar, low and neat from a procedure he had 11 years ago. I had changed that dressing myself at our own kitchen sink morning after morning. I had watched that scar form and fade. No stranger on this earth carried that mark in that exact place on that exact wrist above that exact crooked finger. My stomach dropped straight through the floor of me. "I have to go now," he said quickly, and I heard the new thing in his voice, the thing under the calm, which was fear. He was already turning his cart away, already retreating. "I truly hope you feel better," he said, and then he was moving fast for a man his age toward the front of the store. And just like that, he walked to the checkout and left me standing in a puddle of red sauce while a teenager mopped around my shoes, and the other shoppers looked anywhere but at me. A woman near the register whispered to her companion, "Poor thing," in the soft voice people use for the pitiable. They thought they were watching a grieving old woman lose her grip on reality in a grocery store. They thought grief had finally cracked something in me. What none of them knew, what not one soul in that store could have known, was that I had never once in 40 years been wrong about a body. I had staked my professional life on that certainty 10,000 times and never lost. And I was not wrong now. I did not chase him through the store. Chasing is what a frightened woman does, and something in me had already gone very cold and very clear and very still. Chasing would have proven them all right, would have made me exactly the wild-eyed widow they wanted to see. Instead, I did what I had done 10,000 times at the bedside. I observed. I recorded. I stayed on the far side of the aisle, and I watched him through the gaps in the shelving, and I made myself a set of notes the way I would chart a patient before I trusted my own memory of him. I watched him pay with cash, folding the bills flat with his thumb along the edge, pressing the crease down the way. Walter always had a small habit of his hands I had watched for 4 decades and would have known anywhere. I watched him refuse the receipt with a small shake of his head. I watched him carry his bags out through the automatic doors and load them into an old white sedan with a dent along the rear passenger door, a plain and forgettable car, nothing at all like the truck Walter had loved and washed every Sunday. But he loaded the bags the same way, and that was the thing that finished me, because a man can change his car, and his name, and his voice, but he cannot easily change the habits of his own hands. Heavy cans first into the deep of the trunk. Bread laid on top so it would not crush. Eggs last of all tucked where nothing could shift onto them. The exact order I had watched him load groceries in for 41 years. I read the license plate twice out loud under my breath until I had it by heart, the way I used to read a chart twice before I trusted it. Then I walked to my own car, the one Walter had bought me 2 years before the fire, because he said he wanted me to have something safe and reliable. And the memory of that, of him buying me a safe car while he was already deep inside whatever this was, did something to me I do not have a good word for. And then I did the only thing my body would let me do. I followed him. I stayed 4 car lengths back. My heart pounded so loud in my own ears that I was certain it would somehow give me away. I felt ridiculous and desperate, and more awake than I had felt in 7 months, all at the very same time. A part of me kept saying, "Go home, Kathleen, lock your door, take your pills. Tell yourself that grief has finally shaken something loose in your mind, and let this be a story you never tell anyone." That would have been the easy road, the clean one. But I could not take it, because I knew with the same certainty I had known 100 deaths, that if I turned around now, I would spend whatever years I had left living inside a question this large, and a woman cannot survive inside a question this large. It would have hollowed me out. So I followed. We drove out of the shopping district and into neighborhoods I did not know, streets where the houses grew smaller and older and closer together, the kind of streets Walter and I had never once had reason to drive through in all our years together. That fact struck me even then, even through the pounding of my heart. He had a whole geography I had never entered. A second map of the county laid over the one I knew with its own streets and its own turns and its own pale green house at the end of them. He slowed and turned onto a quiet lane lined with old trees whose roots had buckled the sidewalk, and he parked in front of a small house painted a soft pale green with a white picket fence around a little yard and wind chimes hanging still by the door. He climbed out with his grocery bags, and the front door of that house opened. A woman came out onto the porch. She was in her 50s, I judged, a decade or so younger than me, with dark hair pulled back and a soft worn sweater and no makeup. An ordinary and pleasant-looking woman, the kind of woman you would trust to hold your place in a line. She smiled when she saw him, and it was not the smile you give a neighbor or a delivery. It was the smile of a woman who has been smiling at the same man for a very long time. She leaned in and kissed his cheek and took one of the bags from his hands, saying something to him I was too far away to hear. And then 2 children spilled out the door behind her, a girl of about 10 and a boy of about 8, and they ran straight at him with their arms flung wide open. Grandpa, the girl shouted, her voice carrying clear across the quiet street. "Did you bring the ice cream?" He laughed. That laugh. That lopsided, warm, particular laugh that had lived in my house and my kitchen and my bed for 41 years. The laugh I had promised myself at his graveside I would never hear again in this life. He crouched down and let the children climb onto him, balancing the grocery bags with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times in this yard, by this fence, under these chimes. The woman watched with her hand resting light and easy on his back, and then all 4 of them went inside together, and the door of the pale green house closed behind them. I sat frozen behind the wheel halfway down the block. The afternoon sun poured through my windshield and warmed my face, an ordinary gentle warmth, and it was that ordinariness that undid me, the sun not carrying the day, not stopping. And only then did I realize I was crying. Not sobbing, not the way I had cried at the graveside, just steady, silent tears running down my face without a sound, the way water finds its way down a window pane. 41 years of marriage, 7 months of mourning, nights spent whispering his name into an empty pillow, begging a dead man to come back to me. And here he was alive, laughing, holding 2 children in his arms who were not mine and never would be. I took out my phone with hands that would barely obey me, and I began to take pictures. The house, the car in the drive, the number beside the door, the picket fence, and the still chimes. My hands shook so badly that half the pictures came out blurred and useless, but a few were clear enough. I sat there until the light began to fade and the windows of the pale green house glowed warm and yellow from inside a family at dinner, and then I drove home. I do not remember the drive. I have tried, and I cannot recover a single mile of it. I only remember coming back to myself sitting in my own dark garage with the engine ticking as it cooled, zooming in on his face on my phone, over and over, matching every shadow and line to a man I had already buried in the ground. That night I did not sleep. I did not even try. I sat at the oak table in my kitchen with a single lamp burning and the rest of the house swallowed up in dark, and I spread the old photo albums open in front of me like evidence laid out at an inquest. Our wedding day, the 2 of us impossibly young. His first gray hair, which I had found and teased him about. A beach photo from years back where his shirt had ridden up, and you could see the small mole below his collarbone that he had always hated and been self-conscious about. I laid my new blurry photographs from that afternoon down beside the old clear ones, and I went between them slowly and carefully, the way I would check a living patient against a chart, refusing to let myself rush, refusing to let hope or terror push me faster than the facts allowed. The scar above the brow, the mole below the collarbone, the crooked finger, the surgical seam on the wrist, the slight unevenness of his ears that no one in the world had ever noticed but me. Every mark matched, every single one. And here I will be honest with you about something, because it is the truest part of that long night, and I will not pretend I was braver than I was. For a good hour at that table I tried with everything in me to talk myself out of it. I am a reasonable woman. I did not want to be the widow who saw her dead husband in strangers' faces. So I built the case against myself carefully, the way I would build any case. I told myself that grief does strange things to the mind, that I had read the studies that widows sometimes see the dead everywhere. I got up and I counted my pills in the bathroom cabinet to be sure I had not double-dosed or missed a dose, and set my own head spinning. I stood in front of the mirror, and I said to my own reflection out loud, "Kathleen, you are a tired old woman who misses her husband so badly that she has started conjuring him out of strangers in a store." I tried to make myself believe it. I wanted to believe it, because believing it would have meant the world was still the shape I thought it was. But I could not, because grief does not invent scars. Grief does not put a specific surgical seam on a specific wrist above a specific finger, broken on a specific roof at the age of 15. A stranger does not carry the exact record of a surgery I had nursed with my own 2 hands. A twin, if he had one, which he did not, would not share a finger broken by his own particular fall. These were not the soft tricks of a broken mind. These were hard facts written into a living body by time and accident, And I had read that body for 41 years, and I could no more mistake it than I could mistake my own hands. There are limits to coincidence, and I had crossed past every single one of them somewhere back in that grocery store. What was happening was not madness. It was not grief. It was not chance. It was a plan, and a plan I understood as I sat there in the pool of lamplight has a maker. Somewhere in the dark, someone had built this thing on purpose and had built it around me. I stood up from the table and I walked through my own house, room by room in the dark, and every room felt like a stage set built over a hole in the ground. The recliner where he read the paper, the closet where his coats still hung because I had not yet been able to give them away, and now, God help me, was glad I had not. The photograph on the hall table of the three of us, Walter and Bradley and me at Bradley's college graduation, all of us smiling into a future that I now understood had already been rotten at the root, even then. I stopped in front of that photograph for a long time, because if Walter was alive, then the man beside me in that picture, my son, had stood at a graveside 7 months ago with his hand on my shoulder and lied to me with his whole body. And I did not yet know how deep that lie went, or how many people were standing inside it with him. At 20 minutes to 4 in the morning, I stopped my slow walk through the dark house and I picked up the phone and I called my son. It rang 3 times. On the 4th ring, Bradley answered, his voice thick and slurred with sleep. "Mom, do you know what time it is?" "I need you to come over," I said. "Right now." "Mom, it is the middle of the night. Did something happen? Are you all right?" "Yes," I said, "something happened." There was a pause on the line, and it went on a beat too long, a beat longer than a simple worried pause should go. "Mom," he said, and I heard his voice change, heard it slide into something careful, and rehearsed something I would come to know very well in the days ahead. "If this is about Dad again, we have talked about this. You have been through so much this year. Did you take your pills tonight, Mom? Grief can do strange things to a person, you know that better than anyone. I saw him today," I said. Plainly, without a tremor, "I saw your father alive." The line went completely quiet. And then I heard it, a single sharp, controlled breath drawn in through the nose, the breath of a man bracing himself. And that breath told me more than any word could have. "I followed him home, Bradley," I said into the silence. "I know where he lives now. I saw the house, I saw the woman, I saw the 2 children who call him Grandpa." My voice did not shake at all, and I could hear that steadiness land on the other end of the line and frighten him, because a hysterical mother he knew how to handle. He had a whole script for a hysterical mother, but a calm one he did not. There was a silence then that I will remember for the rest of my life. It went on, and I understood listening to it that it was not the silence of a son frightened that his mother had finally lost her mind. I knew that silence. I had heard it in hospital corridors all my life, the stunned quiet of real bad news. This was not that. This was the silence of a man deciding what to do, the silence of a man doing arithmetic in the dark. "Stay there," he said at last. "Do not go anywhere. Do not call anyone else. I am coming right now." And that was the second thing that went into me and stuck the way Roy Dillard being steered away by the shoulders had stuck. Do not call anyone else. Not stay calm, not "I am so worried about you," not "we will figure this out together." Do not call anyone else. I heard it, and I did not say a word about it, and I filed it away in the cold, clear place that was opening up inside me, right beside the memory of my son turning an old driver away from me at a graveside. The call ended. I went into the bathroom and I looked at myself in the mirror over the sink. I hardly knew the woman looking back at me, the dark hollows under her eyes, the hair pulled back without any care, the face that had aged 10 years in 7 months. But somewhere behind that worn and tired face and the eyes, there was something that had not been there the day before. Something had come awake in me in that grocery store, some old professional thing, cold and steady and clear, and it was looking back at me out of the mirror, and it was not afraid. They had built their whole plan around one belief. They had believed that I was a fragile, grieving woman who would swallow a closed casket and a folded flag and never ask a single hard question. And in believing that they had forgotten the one thing that mattered most, they had forgotten what I did for a living. They had forgotten that of every person on this earth, the one who knew Walter Boyd's real body better than anyone alive, every scar and seam and crooked bone of it was the very woman they were trying to fool. My son was already at that moment driving through the dark toward my house to talk me down, to manage me to put me gently back inside the lie. He had no idea that he was driving toward the one person in the world he could not fool, and that she was sitting at her kitchen table in the lamplight with the photographs spread out in front of her, waiting for him wide awake at last. Bradley let himself in 40 minutes later without knocking the way he had let himself in as a teenager, the way he had let himself in on the night he told me his father was dead. I heard the key and then the front door and then his footsteps coming through the dark house toward the one-lit room, and I sat very still at the oak table with the photographs spread in front of me, and I watched the doorway and waited for my son. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw me. Whatever he had rehearsed in the car, whatever careful, gentle speech he had built for a hysterical mother, I watched it falter on his face when he found me sitting there, calm in the lamplight, dry-eyed, the albums open, my hands folded on the table in front of me. He had come prepared to catch a falling woman. He had not prepared for a woman who was simply waiting. "Mom," he said softly. His eyes went to the photographs, to my new blurry pictures laid beside the old clear ones, and I watched him understand what they were. "What is going on? What is all this?" I did not say a word. I picked up my phone from the table, and I held it out to him across the photographs, and I watched his face while he took it and scrolled. I had learned in 40 years of delivering bad news and receiving it that the face tells you everything, if you have the patience to watch it and the discipline not to fill the silence. So I filled nothing. I only watched. First there was confusion, a small frown, the look of a man trying to make an ordinary explanation fit. Then, as he scrolled, as he came to the clear photographs, the ones where the face was unmistakable, the confusion drained away and something else came up underneath it. Disbelief. And then under the disbelief, rising slow and terrible, the thing I had already heard in his breath on the telephone. Fear. Not the fear of a son frightened for his mother's sinking mind. The fear of a man watching a locked door he thought was safe come open in front of him. He set the phone down on the table, carefully face down, the way you set down something you do not want to look at anymore. "He looks like Dad," he said, and his voice was too even, too smooth a voice he was holding level by force. "But Mom, people resemble each other. It happens all the time. You see a man across a store, the same build, the same gray hair, and grief fills in the rest. Your mind wants it to be him so badly that it makes it him. That is a real thing. That happens to people." "Did you look at the hand?" I asked him. My own voice was quiet. "Did you look at the finger?" "Mom," he said, and he pressed his fingers to his eyes for a moment. "We buried Dad. You were there. I was there. The whole town was there. There was a service and a casket and a headstone. You cannot unsee all of that because of a man in a grocery store." "A closed casket," I said. He looked away from me. That small motion, his eyes going to the dark window, cost him more than he knew. "They told us it was better that way," he said to the window. "The fire was bad. You know what fire does. You of all people know." "Did you see his body, Bradley?" I asked. "Did you personally, with your own eyes, see your father's body?" His jaw tightened. A long moment passed. "No," he said finally. "Neither did I said. And the kitchen, my own kitchen of 40 years, felt very small around the two of us. Neither did I. We took their word for it, you and I. We took a closed box and a folded flag, and we called it your father. And I have been calling it your father for 7 months. He tried again. I will say that for him he tried, and each attempt told me more. He offered me a scam next, some cruel stranger who had learned about our loss and was impersonating Walter to extort money, and I asked him what such a man would gain by walking away from me in a store and going home to a family, and he had no answer. He offered me coincidence again, twins long-lost brothers, and I told him about the finger and the wrist and the surgery I had nursed with my own 2 hands, and he had no answer for that either. 3 times he reached for an ordinary explanation, and 3 times I set the body in front of him, the plain, undeniable record of it, and 3 times the explanation died in his mouth. And with each one I watched him understand a little more clearly that his mother was not going to be talked down, and that the woman across the table from him was not the fragile widow the whole plan had counted on. Finally he ran out of explanations. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, in his father's chair, and he put his face in his hands, and for a moment I thought he might tell me everything right there. But he was not ready yet. The lie had one more layer to shed. "I want to go back there," I said, standing up from the table. "Tonight, right now, I want you to drive me, and I want you to sit beside me, and I want you to look at that house with me. And if I am a crazy old woman conjuring my dead husband out of a stranger, then you will have proved it, and I will let it go. And I will take my pills and see my doctor and never speak of it again. But you will come with me first. You will look with me first. Mom, this is not healthy. It is the middle of the night. "Are you coming," I said, "or am I going alone?" "Because I am going, Bradley. One way or the other, I am going back to that house." He hesitated. And he hesitated just a beat too long, one beat longer than an innocent man would have needed, and in that beat, I felt the first crack open clean across the floor of 41 years of my life. Because a son who truly believed his mother was chasing a ghost would have driven her out there in a heartbeat, gladly certain the empty confirmation would finally set her free. Only a son who knew what was waiting at that house would hesitate. "Fine," he said at last. "Fine, we will go. So you can see it is not him. So you can finally let this go." We drove in silence through the sleeping town. He drove. I gave him no directions, and I noticed that he needed none until we were most of the way there. And then near the end, he slowed and hesitated at a turn as though performing uncertainty, and I let him perform it. I said that when the pale green house when we came onto the quiet tree-lined lane, and he pulled over and parked a little way down the block and cut the engine, and we sat in the dark and the ticking quiet, and we watched. For a long time, nothing happened. The house sat dark and still, the chimes hanging motionless, a single porch light burning. And then, because even a man living 2 lives still has to take out his trash on a Tuesday night, the front door of the pale green house opened, and Walter stepped out onto the porch in an undershirt to bring the trash can up from the curb. Bradley leaned forward. I was watching him, and not the house, because I already knew what was on the porch, and it was my son's face I needed to read now. The color drained out of it the way water drains out of a sink all at once from the top down. He did not move. He did not breathe. He stared through the windshield at the man on the porch, the man he had helped me bury, and then his hands came up off the steering wheel slowly and covered his mouth. And my son began to cry. Not the way a man cries when he is shocked. I know shock. I have caused it and witnessed it 1,000 times. Shock is silent and blank and slack. This was not that. This was the sound a person makes when a thing they have carried a very long time, carried so long they have half forgotten they are carrying it, finally shifts its full weight and cracks their spine. It came up out of him in a low, broken sound behind his hands, and his shoulders shook, and he could not stop it, and did not try. "Mom," he whispered through his fingers. His eyes did not leave the porch. "Mom, I am so sorry." And in that moment, before he said one more word, before a single fact of it was laid out, I understood the whole shape of what I was inside of. Because sorry is not the word of a man who has just discovered something. Sorry is the word of a man who has always known. Sorry meant guilt, and guilt meant knowledge, and knowledge meant this had never once been in my head. My husband was alive on that porch in the dark, and my only son was weeping in the seat beside me, and he was not weeping from joy or from shock. He was weeping from a guilt he had carried so long it had grown into him, and it was finally at last breaking him open in front of me. Bradley did not start the car. Walter carried the trash can back inside, and the porch light went out, and the street went dark, and still again, and still my son sat there gripping the wheel with his forehead pressed against it, his shoulders heaving, making that low, broken sound. I had seen Bradley cry twice before in his adult life, when his first marriage came apart, when his old dog died in his arms on the vet's table. But I had never seen anything like this, and I sat very still, and I let it run its course, because I needed him emptied out. A full man guards himself. An emptied one tells the truth. "Tell me," I said when the worst of it had passed, and he had gone quiet and hollow. My voice sounded far away, even to my own ears, as if someone else were speaking through me, someone very calm. "Tell me right now. All of it." He lifted his head from the wheel. His eyes were red and raw and swollen, and in them was a thing I had never once seen on my son's face in 38 years of being his mother. Shame. Naked and total shame. "Dad did not die in that fire," he said. The words came out of him and hung in the closed dark car, heavy and final, and almost a relief. The relief of a thing set down after being carried too far. I did not scream. I did not gasp. Some part of me had already crossed hours ago in the grocery store over into a place where shock could no longer reach me. I only nodded once. "Go on," I said. He took a breath like a man about to go down underwater and not sure he would come back up. "He has another family, Mom," he said. "He has had one for over 20 years. That woman is named Sharon. Those are her grandchildren, not his by blood, hers from her own daughter, but he has helped raise them, and they call him Grandpa. He has lived part of his life in that house for 2 decades. He told me when it all came out that it started as a mistake. One thing, one bad choice on the road years ago, and then it just never ended. It grew. It became a whole second life, and by the time he understood what it was, he said he could not find the door out of it. 20 years. I stared straight ahead through the windshield at the empty, dark street, and 20 years arranged itself in front of me. 20 years of Boyd freight keeping him on the road. 20 years of long hauls of nights away, of trips that ran 3 days when I thought they should run 1. 20 years of me defending his absence to my friends when they raised their eyebrows and said a husband should not be gone so much. I had told them he was building something for our family. I had told them he was a good provider, that the work was hard and the hours were long, and that was the price of it. I had defended that man's absence with my whole open heart over and over for 2 decades, while he slept in a pale green house across the county with another woman, and helped raise another woman's grandchildren, and let them call him a name that was not even his. How long have you known? I asked. About 3 years, Bradley admitted, and his voice broke on it, and he had to start again. About 3 years. I found out by accident, Mom. I swear to you it was by accident. He had brought me in to help with the books at Boyd Freight. You remember he said he was getting older and wanted family handling the money instead of strangers. And I saw things that did not line up. 2 sets of utility bills going out. 2 insurance policies. Regular payments to an address across the county that I did not recognize and that had nothing to do with the company. I thought at first it was fraud against him, someone skimming. So I pulled the thread. And the thread led to that house. To Sharon. When I brought it to him, when I sat him down with the papers, he did not even try to deny it. He just went gray and quiet, and he told me everything. And then he begged me. He begged me not to tell you. And you did not, I said. He said it would destroy you, Bradley whispered. He said if you ever found out, it would not just break your heart, it would take your whole life apart, because you would divorce him, and rightly, and you would take half of everything in the divorce. The company, the house, all of it. He said the truth would kill you slower and crueler than any lie ever could. And I told myself he was right. I told myself I was protecting you by staying quiet. Mom, I have to live with the fact that I told myself that. I turned in the seat and looked at my son in the dark. And what did he offer you? I asked. To keep you quiet for 3 years. What did he give you? He flinched. He flinched as though I had struck him. And that flinch told me I had guessed right, and that there was worse coming, and I made myself sit still and steady and ready to hear it. 7 months ago, Bradley said, staring at his own hands. He came to me with a plan. He said he was done. Done living 2 lives, done with the road and the lies and the strain of it. He said he was old now, and he wanted to spend whatever years he had left in one place with Sharon out in the open, as one man in one house. But he could not divorce you. A divorce would ruin him. And so he had decided. He told me that it would be cleaner, simpler, kinder to everyone if you simply believed he was dead. Cleaner for whom I said. For him, Bradley said. And then so quietly I almost lost it under the tick of the cooling engine. And for me. I went very still. For you, I repeated. He could not meet my eyes. He talked to the windshield, to his hands, to the dark, to anywhere but my face. If he divorced you, everything would go through a court, he said. Lawyers. Discovery. They would pull the company books apart in front of a judge. And Mom, if anyone ever pulled those books all the way apart, they would have found what he took. What did he take, Bradley? I said. For 20 years he skimmed from Boyd Freight, my son said. And the words came faster now, the way they do once the worst of it is loose. Slow, careful, never enough in any one year to show. He built the money up quietly over 2 decades under a second name he had made for himself, Gordon Hale, in bank accounts. You and I never knew existed. A divorce would have exposed every dollar of it. Not just the affair, the theft. He would have gone to prison, Mom, real prison, and even after that you would have taken half of whatever was left. But a dead man does not get audited. A dead man does not sit in a courtroom while lawyers read his bank records out loud. When he died on paper, his estate came out to almost nothing, because he had already moved the real money out ahead of the fire into the Gordon Hale accounts where no court would ever think to look. And some of it he moved to me. To you, I repeated. He signed over most of his controlling interest in Boyd Freight to me while he was still alive, so it would not sit in his estate where a court could reach it, Bradley said. And there was a life insurance policy on him. He changed the beneficiary so the payout came to me instead of to you. I was supposed to take care of you after. Give you a monthly allowance out of it. Make sure you never wanted for anything, never had to worry about money, lived comfortably the rest of your days. That was the deal he made me swear to. He said your mother will be provided for, she will just never know how, and it is better that way. An allowance. As if I were a child. As if I were a stray to be fed and managed and kept quiet in a corner of my own life. I sat with that word for a moment allowance, and I felt something in me that had been soft for 41 years finish turning to stone. And the body, I said. Because I was a nurse. And a nurse always comes back to the body. Always the body is where the truth lives. Whose body did I bury, Bradley? You cannot conjure a corpse out of nothing. Somebody was in that casket. Somebody was identified and certified and signed for and put in the ground under your father's name. Who was he? And who signed him? Bradley wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. A boy's gesture, one I had seen 10,000 times across the years, and it broke something in me to see it now attached to all of this. There was a man, he said. A homeless man. He was already dying, Mom, before Dad ever went near him. He had a terminal illness, months to live. At most everyone who knew him knew it. He had no family in the world except a niece 3 states away that he had not spoken to in years. Dad found him months before down near the shelter by the old rail yard. And Daddy Bradley's voice caught. He worked on that man for months. Brought him food. Sat with him. Made himself the one person in the world who cared whether that man lived or died. Became his only friend, his only contact, the name on the shelter's card in case of emergency. Nobody laid a hand on him, Mom. I need you to hear that part and believe it, because it is the one piece of this I could not have lived with otherwise. Nobody hurt him. He was dying already, and one night a few months into it, he died on his own in his sleep of the illness that was already killing him. Natural. Quiet. Alone. I closed my eyes when he said that because I understood it, and understanding it made me sick to the center of myself. I understood exactly why Walter had chosen a dying homeless man with one estranged niece. It was not only that the man was near death, it was that the man had already been erased by the world long before Walter ever found him. There was no one left to stand up at a graveside and say, "Wait, that is not who you think it is." No family to demand a second look. No one to ask questions. Walter had picked a person the world had already forgotten, and then he had made himself the only one who would notice the man was gone, so that when the man died, there would be no alarm. Only a body unclaimed and unwatched, ready to be given a new name. And for 40 years I had held the hands of exactly those people, the forgotten ones, the ones no one came for, and I had made it my whole life's work to see that each of them left this world with dignity and with their own name. And my husband had taken one of them and used him as a prop in a play about his own death. And when he died, I said, this dying man on his own in his sleep. What then? Because a man does not die and stay fresh, Bradley. There is timing to a body. If Walter staged a fire on a county road, the body in that car had to be recent enough to pass. How did he manage that? Bradley was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was full of a kind of horror at his own father. Dad had cold storage access at the freight depot, he said, for perishable freight. He had keys, he had the codes, he came and went at all hours, and no one ever questioned it. It was his company. When the man died, Dad, he kept the body. At the depot. In the cold. For a few days until he had the night and the road and the weather he wanted. And then he took it out to that county road late at night, and he staged the fire around the car. He put his own wallet in the man's pocket. His wedding ring on the man's hand. His identification in the glove box where it would survive. And then a fire hot enough that the rest of it, the face, the fingerprints, all of it became a formality. What was left you identify by the papers and the effects and the teeth. And the papers said Walter Boyd. The ring said Walter Boyd. And the one man who had cared whether that homeless soul lived or died was standing right there ready to weep at the graveside of his own faked death. I sat in the dark and I did the thing I had done at 10,000 bedsides across 40 years. I stayed calm. I let the facts lie down in order in front of me, and I looked at them one at a time. This was no longer a heartbreak. A heartbreak is a private and shapeless thing. This was a crime, and a crime has a shape. It has names and dates and a paper trail, and a body in the wrong grave, and my own son's fingerprints were on the whole of it. And the teeth, I said, because that is the thing that should have stopped it cold. A burned body gets identified by the dental records. The medical examiner does not just take a wallet's word for it. Somebody compared dental charts and signed a name to that identification. That is the wall this should have crashed into. Who got it through that wall, Bradley? Who signed the dental identification? I went quiet. He went very quiet. Who signed the dental identification? Bradley, I said again softer, which with me has always been more frightening than louder. I pushed it through, he said finally, so low I nearly lost it. I pushed the medical examiner's office to move fast. I told them you were fragile, that you were not eating, not sleeping, that a long drawn-out identification process would break you, that we needed to lay Dad to rest quickly for your sake. I leaned on that. Your grief, I used your grief to hurry them. And there was a dentist. A man Dad knew, a man Dad had something on, or paid, or both. Both I did not want to know which. He provided charts, and he signed off that they matched. And because a grieving family was begging for speed, and because a licensed dentist had signed it, went through faster than it ever should have. Nobody looked twice. I understood then how it had been done, all of it, and I understood it in a way that made my stomach turn, because they had used the machinery of kindness against me. A burned body, a licensed dentist's signature, a family pleading for a quick and merciful burial. Every gate that should have stopped this had been propped open with my own grief and my own good name and my own trusting nature. They had not broken through the walls. They had walked through the doors, and I had held each door for them, without knowing. Take me home, I said. Mom, we need to talk about this. We need to figure out together what we are going to do. Please, let me help you think this through. Take me home, Bradley. He started the car. We did not speak again, not one word, the whole way back through the dark and sleeping town. And I want you to understand that everything in me wanted to scream at him. Everything in me wanted to take that steering wheel and beat my fists against it and howl at my son for standing beside me at a graveside with his hand on my shoulder while he knew the whole time. But anger is loud and clumsy, and it warns the thing you are hunting. I had spent 40 years learning to keep my hands perfectly steady in the worst moments of other people's lives, learning to hold a level voice while the monitors screamed and families fell apart around me. And I understood sitting there in the dark beside my weeping son that this was the moment all of that had been training me for. So I kept my hands folded in my lap. I kept my face turned to the window, and I let him drive me home in silence while I thought. When he pulled into my driveway, I opened the door and got out without looking at him. Mom, please, he called after me, leaning across the seat. Please do not do anything. Please do not go to anyone. Let me fix this. Let me make it right. There has to be a way to make this right for you, without everything coming down. Just give me a little time, please. I did not answer him. I went inside and I shut the door and I threw the bolt and I stood in my dark front hall and listened until I heard his car back out of the drive and pull away down the street. Then I went and I sat on the edge of my bed, my side of the bed, the edge I had trained myself to leave in 7 months of learning to sleep in the middle, and I looked around at the shape of the life I had thought I lived. 41 years of it. The photographs on the dresser. His reading glasses still in the drawer I had not been able to empty. All of it a stage set built over a hole, and I had walked its rooms my whole life and never once heard how hollow they rang. And I made myself a promise sitting there on the edge of my bed in the dark before dawn. I was not going to be the woman who cried in silence. Not anymore. I had done my crying 7 months of it, honest and complete. And it turned out every tear had been stolen from me under false pretenses. I would not give them one more. Whatever came next, and I did not yet know what it would be. It would not be forgiveness, and it would not be silence, and it would not be an allowance quietly paid into my account by the son who had helped bury me alive. It would be the truth, all of it. Laid out in the hard, clean light where everyone could see it, where no dentist's signature and no folded flag and no closed casket could hide a single piece of it. They had built their whole plan on the belief that I was soft and grieving and finished. They were about to learn what 40 years at the edge of death had actually made of me. For 4 days after that night I did nothing at all, and those 4 days were the hardest days of the whole ordeal, harder in their way than the grocery store, harder than the confession in the car. Because doing nothing when every nerve in your body is screaming to act is its own kind of labor. I did not answer Bradley's calls. He called the morning after, and again that afternoon, and again the next day, and I let every one of them ring out and go silent. I watched him from the upstairs window pull into my driveway twice, sit in his car for a while, working up his nerve, come to the door and knock knock again, and finally give up and leave when I did not open it. Text messages arrived, and I let them sit unread on the screen, gray bubbles piling up one after another. Mom, please. Mom, talk to me. Mom, I am worried about you. Please just tell me you are all right. Mom, I love you. Please do not shut me out. 41 years of being a wife and a mother had trained me deep in the bone to always answer, always soothe, always reach out and fix the broken thing and reassure the frightened person on the other end. Every instinct I had pulled at me to pick up the phone and comfort my son, and I did not. For the first time in my life, I chose silence and held it. Not the silence of a frightened woman hiding, the silence of a woman taking careful, deliberate aim who knows that the moment she speaks, she gives herself away. I slept very little across those 4 days, but I was not pacing the house anymore, and I was not weeping into pillows. Something had settled in me, cold and steady and clear, and it did not waver. I kept turning Bradley's confession over and over, not as a wife and not as a mother, but the way I used to review a difficult case at the end of a long shift, looking for what I had missed, testing each piece against the others. A faked death, a stolen name Gordon Hale built and fed for 2 decades, nearly $2 million skimmed and hidden, a forged dental identification signed by a bought dentist, a body in the wrong grave, a son made complicit and paid off with an inheritance and a controlling interest in a company. This was not betrayal, I kept telling myself to keep my own feet under me. Betrayal is a feeling, and feelings are shapeless, and they drown you. This was a list of crimes. And a list can be proven item by item in the hard light of day. On the second of those 4 days, I did allow myself one thing, one human thing, and it turned out to be the thing that steadied me for everything that came after. I called the one person left in the world I trusted completely. Ruth Callahan and I had worked side by side on the hospice ward for almost 30 years. She was a few years older than me, retired now as I was, and there is a kind of friendship that forms only between 2 people who have carried the same terrible weight for a long time and never once let it drop, and Ruth was that friend to me. She had watched me sit with the dying for 3 decades and never flinch, and I had done the same beside her. I did not tell her everything over the phone. I only said, Ruth, I need to sit across a table from someone who knew me before all of this, someone who knows what I am and what I am not. And she said she would come, and she came that same afternoon. She arrived with a thermos of coffee under her arm and a paper bag of the lemon cookies she always kept in her car, and she sat down at my oak table, and she listened to the whole thing from the beginning without interrupting me once. The grocery store, the cough, the finger in the wrist, the pale green house and the woman and the children, Bradley in the car, the confession, all of it. She let me lay it all out, and she turned her coffee cup slowly around and around in her 2 hands. And when I finally ran out of words, she was quiet for a long while looking at me. Kathleen, she said at last, in all the years I have known you, 30 years, I have never once seen you get a body wrong. Not one single time. I watched you walk into a room and tell me a man had 3 days left when the doctors upstairs were still writing 3 weeks in his chart, and you were right every time down to the afternoon. You read bodies the way other people read the newspaper. So I am going to say this to you plainly, and I want you to hear it. If you tell me the man in that grave is not Walter, then the man in that grave is not Walter. I would stake my own life on your eyes. And here is the part you are not letting yourself see yet, because you are too deep in the hurt of it. You are not a crazy widow, Kathleen. You are the one person on this whole earth who is equipped to prove what they did. They picked the wrong woman to bury. I told her I was afraid. And when she asked me of what I found, that it was not Walter I was afraid of. It was Bradley. It was the thought of being the mother who put her own son in a courtroom who sent her own boy to prison. I said the words out loud to her, and they sat there terrible between us on the table. Ruth reached across and took my hand, the way the 2 of us had taken so many hands over so many years, and she held it firm. Kathleen, she said, listen to me. Your son helped bury you alive for 7 months. He stood at that graveside with his hand on your shoulder, and he watched you come apart, and he said nothing. He let you learn to sleep in the middle of your own bed. Grief is a thing that happens to a person. It falls on you like weather. No one chooses it. But what Bradley did to you was not weather. It was a choice made cold and remade every single morning for 7 months that he woke up and decided again to keep lying to your face. You did not do this to your family. He did. And letting the truth stand up in the light is not revenge, Kathleen. Do not let anyone, least of all yourself, call it revenge. It is just the truth finally allowed to stand up. That was the thing I had needed to hear, and I had needed to hear it from her because Ruth had no stake in it, except loving me. She was right, and her being right unlocked something. Because they had made one enormous error, the whole scheme rested on one wrong assumption, and Ruth's certainty helped me see it clearly at last. Bradley had rushed the identification. He had leaned on the medical examiner's office and told them his mother was too fragile to endure a slow process. He had used my grief as the lever. But in doing that, he had forgotten what his mother did for a living. He had forgotten that of every person on the earth, the one who knew Walter's real body better than anyone alive, every tooth and scar and surgery and crooked bone was the very woman the whole thing was designed to fool. They had built a lie about a body, and then they had let the world's leading expert on that particular body grieve at its graveside. Before Ruth left that afternoon, she did one more thing for me, and it turned out to matter more than either of us knew at the time. She reminded me of a day years back when Walter had needed a tooth seen to and had put it off in his usual way, and I had finally made the appointment and could not take him because I was on shift, and Ruth had driven him herself as a favor and sat in the waiting room. She remembered it because Walter had complained the entire drive there and the entire drive back, and she had teased me about it for weeks. Ruth remembered Walter's real dentist by name, remembered the little office, remembered Walter grumbling in the chair. It was a small thing, but it meant that when the time came, I was not the only living person who could speak to the truth of Walter Boyd's actual dental history. I had a witness. I filed that away too. When Ruth had gone, I sat back down at my table, and I did something that steadied me more than anything else across those 4 days. I took out a fresh notebook, the spiral kind I had used for 40 years to chart patients, and I began to build the case the only way I knew how, the way I had charted the dying. Columns, dates, observations, facts on one side and sources on the other. I wrote out everything Bradley had told me, every name and every mechanism, and beside each item I wrote what would prove it and where that proof might be found. Faked death proven by the body itself, exhumation and testing. Forged identification proven by the dental report and the true dental history. The theft proven by bank records under the Gordon Hale name. It calmed me the way charting had always calmed me, turning a screaming chaos into orderly rows a person could actually work through one line at a time. By the end of that notebook's first pages, I was no longer a drowning widow. I was a nurse with a chart, and I had a plan of care, and the plan was the truth. On the 4th morning, I woke before dawn, clear-headed for the first time in a week, and I knew exactly what I was going to do, and in what order. I showered, and I dressed carefully, not like a widow to be pitied in soft dark colors, but like the professional I had been for 40 years in the crisp clothes I used to wear to speak to doctors and families. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone older than I had been a year before, yes. But I also saw someone sharper awake present in her own eyes, in a way that woman in the bathroom mirror at 4 in the morning had not quite been. I was ready to begin. I would not start with the money. The money was the deepest part buried under fake names and accounts I had no legal way to touch, and if I went at it clumsily, I would only warn them. I would start instead with the one thing on this earth I could read better than any lawyer or detective alive. I would start with the body and the paperwork of its death. I was the surviving spouse. I was the next of kin. And under the law that gave me a plain right to request the records of my own husband's death, and no one, not Bradley, not a bought dentist, not the whole machinery of the scheme could stop me from doing that. I drove to the county office that same morning, and I filled out the forms in my own steady hand. I requested a certified copy of the death certificate. I requested the medical examiner's report, and specifically the basis and documentation of the identification. The clerk behind the counter, a tired, kind woman about my age, told me these things took time, a few days at least, and asked if I was sure I wanted to put myself through reviewing them. Given, she said gently, glancing at where I had written surviving spouse. I told her I was sure. I told her I would wait as long as it took. And I meant it, because waiting is a thing I know how to do. I have sat by 100 beds waiting for a breath that was a long time coming. I know how to wait for a thing that is certain to arrive on its own schedule, and not mine. While those records worked their slow way toward me, I did the second thing. I found a private investigator. His name was Ted Marsh, and he worked out of a small office on the 3rd floor of a plain brick building downtown that I had walked past 100 times in my life and never once looked up at. He was a man in his late 60s, thin with sparse gray hair combed carefully over a freckled scalp, and a pair of sharp, pale eyes that took me in completely in the first 3 seconds I stood in his doorway, and then relaxed as if he had decided I was not going to waste his time. I sat down across from his cluttered desk and I told him what I needed, and just as importantly, what I did not. I do not want you to break a single law, I said to him. Not one. I do not want you touching a bank account or making a phone call under a false name or photographing anything through a window. I have thought about this carefully. If this ends where I think it will end in a courtroom, and I will not hand them one thread they can pull to unravel it. I only want what any citizen may lawfully see. Public records, property records, court filings, and a careful set of eyes watching a house from a public street. Ted Marsh leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a while. Is he missing? He asked me. Or hiding? Hiding, I said, and legally dead. That got his full attention. The sharp eyes came up. He listened to the whole story then with his hands folded on the desk in front of him, not writing anything, just listening. And when I was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded slowly. Mrs. Boyd, he said, in 40 years of this work, I have chased a great many cheating husbands. This is not a cheating husband. If half of what you have told me is true, this is identity fraud. This is insurance fraud. This is a body in a grave under a false name and a death certificate that is a lie. That is not a matter for a divorce lawyer. That is a matter for a district attorney, and it is a prison sentence for the people who did it. Do you understand what you are starting? I understand it, I said. I want it documented, Mr. Marsh. Not suspected, not felt. Proven on paper in a way that no one can wave away as a grieving woman's imagination. I can do that, he said. And I believed him. Here I have to tell you about the one true mistake I made, because I promised myself when I began telling this that I would tell it honestly, and an honest account of me includes the ways I got it wrong. I am not a detective. I had never done anything like this in my life. And in my certainty and the cold, clear confidence that had carried me since the grocery store, I got ahead of myself. I had it fixed in my mind that the inside person, the one who had greased the dental identification through the examiner's office, had to be someone with access to the company's affairs, someone Walter trusted with paper. And there was an obvious candidate. Boyd Freight had a longtime office manager, a woman named Delia Frost, who had kept the company's books and files for close to 20 years, who knew where every document lived, who had been at the funeral in a black dress, dabbing her eyes. I became convinced over a day and a night of turning it over in my notebook that Delia Frost was the one who had made the paperwork move. I asked Ted Marsh to look into her. I spent 2 of his days and a good deal of my money having him pull what public record there was on Delia Frost, her property, her filings, her connections, and I sat up nights building a case against her in my chart that felt at the time airtight. It was wrong, all of it. Delia Frost had nothing to do with any of it. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a loyal office manager who had wept honestly at her boss's funeral. And worse than merely wasting 2 days and Ted Marsh's time, my interest in her did damage. Because Delia Frost, being a loyal employee, mentioned to Bradley in passing that a man had been around asking questions about her and about the company's records. She did not think much of it, but Bradley did. And so days before I was ready, I got a text from my son that was different from the others, sharper, more awake. Mom, he wrote, is someone looking into the company, into Dad's affairs. Please, if you have hired someone, we need to talk before this goes somewhere. You cannot take it back. I had spooked him. My own carelessness had nearly blown the whole thing open before I had a single piece of hard proof in my hands. I sat and looked at that text for a long time with my heart going hard, and I understood 2 things at once. The first was that I had been arrogant. I had let my certainty run ahead of my evidence, exactly the thing I had spent 40 years training myself never to do at a bedside, where a confident wrong guess can kill a person. The second was that I now had to repair the damage, and quickly, and that meant I had to do the hardest thing in the whole ordeal sooner than I had planned. I had to reach out to my son and put him back to sleep. I had to play the broken, grieving mother on purpose to a boy who had known me all his life. I made myself wait an hour so I would not seem to be leaping at the phone. Then I called him, and when he answered, fast frightened, I let my voice go soft and thin and tired, the voice of a woman worn down to nothing. Bradley, I said, I am so tired, sweetheart. I have not been sleeping. I did talk to a man, I did. I am ashamed of it. I was so upset after that night that I thought I needed someone to help me understand it all. But I have been thinking, and I do not have it in me to tear this family apart. I do not. Your father is your father. Whatever he did, I am an old woman, and I do not have the years left to spend them in courtrooms and lawyers' offices. I called the man and I told him to stop. I just want to understand it, that is all, and then I want to find some way to live with it quietly. And I heard the relief come down the line into my son's breath, and I hated myself a little for how easily it came, and I understood in that moment that I had learned to lie to Bradley, the same way Walter had learned to lie to me one necessary piece at a time. I did not like the woman I heard on that phone, but she bought me back the time I had nearly lost, and Delia Frost taught me the lesson I needed from that hour on. I did not act on a single thing I had not proven, no matter how certain I felt. Certainty is not proof. 40 years should have taught me that already. It took Delia Frost to teach it to me again. The records came back before the week was out, and they taught me where the real weak link had been all along, and it was not Delia Frost. I sat at my oak table with the medical examiner's report spread out in front of me, and I read it the way I had read 10,000 charts slowly, front to back, refusing to skip. And on the second page I found it. The thing that would, when I finally pulled it, bring the whole structure down. The identification of the body had rested primarily on a comparison of dental records, and the report named the dentist who had supposedly provided Walter's dental charts for that comparison. It was a name I had never seen before in my life. Not once. And here is the thing they had all forgotten, the thing no lie could get around. In 41 years of marriage, I had made every single one of Walter's dental appointments myself. Every one. He hated the dentist with a child's pure hatred. He would put a toothache off for months rather than go, and it fell to me always to call and schedule it and remind him, and half the time drive him there myself and sit in the waiting room like Ruth had that one time. I knew the name of Walter's dentist the way I knew my own address, the way I knew my own name. Dr. Allen Pruitt on 4th Street for 30 years. The name on this report was not Dr. Allen Pruitt. It was a stranger. Walter Boyd had never in his life sat in the chair of the dentist, whose charts had supposedly identified his burned body. And there was more, and this was the piece that made it not just suspicious, but impossible. Provably impossible in a way a jury could understand. The report described among the matching features a porcelain crown on a lower right molar. A crown, and I sat back in my chair and I felt the whole thing turn over because Walter Boyd never in his entire life had a single crown. Not one. I knew every tooth in that man's head. He had one old silver amalgam filling on that side low right put in when he was a young man long before I met him, and I had seen the film of it with my own eyes years ago, sitting beside him in Dr. Pruitt's chair, holding his hand, because he could not stand the sound of the drill and needed me there like a boy. A filling and a crown are not the same thing. They are not made of the same material, they do not sit the same way in the tooth, they do not look remotely alike on an X-ray. Any first-year dental student could tell one from the other at a glance. No honest comparison of real records could ever mistake an old silver filling for a porcelain crown. Someone had sat down and written a description of a mouth, and it was not Walter's mouth. It was an invented mouth, or the mouth of the poor dead stranger, described and signed and sworn to under my husband's name as if it were fact. It was a forgery, and it was a clumsy one. Clumsy, because whoever wrote it had counted on no one who truly knew that mouth ever reading it. I let my breath out slow the way I used to when a monitor finally settled from a wild rhythm into a steady one. Here was the crack. Here was the single loose thread that pulled would take the whole garment apart. A lawyer would not have caught it. A detective would not have caught it. The medical examiner's own office had not caught it because they had been handed records by a licensed dentist and told by a grieving family to hurry, and they had no earthly reason to doubt either. But I was not a lawyer or a detective or a clerk. I was the woman who had scheduled that man's every appointment for 41 years, who had held his hand through every filling, who had nagged and driven and waited. I was the one living person who carried the true map of Walter Boyd's mouth, and the map on that report was a lie, and I could prove it, and I had a second witness in Ruth who could name his real dentist, and I had that real dentist's 30 years of real records sitting in an office on 4th Street where anyone with the authority could subpoena them. Ted Marsh, meanwhile, working only from public streets and public records, exactly as I had asked, traced the dentist whose false name was on the report. He turned out to be a man named Harold Vane, whose practice was failing, who had a gambling matter and a suspended license question in his past. Exactly the sort of man a person like Walter with money and a problem could find and buy. I did not go near Harold Vane. I did not confront him or warn him or give him one single reason to run or to talk to Bradley. I simply had Ted Marsh document from the public record who he was and what his troubles were, and I added it to my chart, another clean, provable line. The purchased silence now had a face and a name and a motive, and I had gotten it without breaking a single law or tipping a single hand. Ted Marsh brought me the rest a few days later in a plain folder, and everything in it was exactly what I had asked for, and nothing more. The pale green house was owned on the county's public property records by a man named Gordon Hale, purchased 11 years earlier. He had watched the house from the public street and mapped the man's ordinary week. He left every morning at the same hour. He came home in the evening. Weekends belonged to the children. Sunday mornings belonged to a church 3 streets over. A quiet, decent church-going man the neighbors would surely have said a good grandfather, a good neighbor. Ted Marsh, also working the public record, found the bones of how the Gordon Hale identity had been built, and it grounded everything Bradley had told me in the dark. The identity was old, older than the house, going back more than 2 decades, built slowly and patiently, the way such things were built in the years before everything went digital. Seated with a social security number that had belonged to a child who had died in infancy long ago in another state, a number that had never been flagged because the child had never lived to use it. It was the kind of thing a man who spent his life in freight moving among truck stops and depots and the loose edges of the working world could learn to do if he watched the wrong people long enough and had the patience to build it over years. It was not magic. It was just slow, careful, decades-long deceit, and now it was on paper in front of me, traceable, provable. I took the property records and the death report and the photographs and everything. Ted Marsh had lawfully gathered, and I built the rest of it myself, out of documents I had every legal right to hold in my own 2 hands. Our joint tax returns, 40 years of them in the filing cabinet in the spare room. The business filings for Boyd Freight, which I had co-owned on paper for decades, and to my shame had never once read closely, having always trusted Walter to handle the money the way I trusted him to handle everything. And the more I read, the more the shape of what Bradley had described rose up off the pages. Money leaving the company in small, careful amounts year after year after year, some small enough that no single year ever looked wrong, but which laid end to end across 2 decades, came to a fortune. Vanishing into places our tax returns never quite accounted for. It was all there, faint but unmistakable once you knew to look, like the tracks of an animal you had walked past 1,000 times without ever learning to see. There was one document in that filing cabinet that stopped me cold, and it had nothing to do with money. It was an old file of family papers, and folded into it was a life insurance policy, and I set it aside almost without looking at it, meaning to come back to it, not yet understanding what it was. I will come back to it too in this telling, because it belongs later in its proper terrible place. For the moment I only registered that it was there, a policy, and I set it down and kept working, and I did not yet know that it was the single most important piece of paper in the whole house. And there was one quiet afternoon in the middle of all that reading that I have to set down because it was the moment the crime and the heartbreak became one thing, and I could no longer keep them in separate columns of my chart. I was cross-referencing the small withdrawals against the calendar, trying to find the year the second household truly began, and I found it, or found near enough to it, a change in the pattern of the money that lined up with a particular summer. And I got up and I went to the photo albums to that summer, and I found the pictures from a family vacation we had taken, the 3 of us, Walter and Bradley and me, at a lake. And I looked at those photographs, which I had looked at 100 times over the years with nothing but fondness. And this time I saw what I had never let myself see. Walter in every picture was somewhere else. His body was at the lake with his wife and his son, but his eyes were turned away out over the water at the middle distance, already gone. In one photograph I was laughing at something with my whole face turned up to him, and he was looking past me at nothing, and I understood that in that very summer, in that very photograph, he had already begun the other life, and that I had smiled up at a man who was even then only half in the room with me. I sat with that photograph for a long time. That was the afternoon I did my last crying over Walter Boyd, quietly over an old vacation picture, and when it was done, and it did not come back. But I still needed one thing more before I could take it all to anyone, and it was the hardest thing of all. I needed Bradley to say it again. Not to me in the dark of a parked car in the middle of the night, where it was only a mother and a son and a breaking heart, and no one else in the world to hear it. I needed him to say it somewhere it could be kept. I needed his own voice freely given laying it out, so that when the whole thing stood up in the light, it would stand on his own words and not on my account of a conversation no one else had witnessed. I had looked into the law carefully because I would not build my case on anything a court could throw out. North Carolina, where I have lived my whole life, is a one-party consent state. That means that if I am part of a conversation, if I am one of the 2 people talking, I am permitted to record it, and I do not need the other person's permission, and it can be used. I did not need Bradley to agree to be recorded. I only needed to be sitting across the table from him with the recorder on. That was lawful. I checked it twice, and then I checked it a third time with a plain question to a legal aid line framing it as a general question, and I was sure. I called him. "Mom," he answered on the very first ring, the relief and worry both in his voice at once, and I understood that my performance on the earlier call had worked, that he believed his fragile mother had decided to let it lie. "Are you all right?" he said. "I have been so worried about you, you have not been answering." "I am tired, sweetheart," I said, and I let my voice carry all the exhaustion I truly felt so that I would not have to manufacture it. That part was not a lie. I do not want to fight anymore, Bradley. I have thought, and I am too old and too tired to spend my last years at war with my own family. I just want to understand it all, the whole of it, so that I can find some way to make my peace and live with it. Come and have lunch with me. Somewhere quiet, just the two of us. Let me hear it once more, all of it, so I can lay it down. The relief in his breath very nearly made me lose my nerve, because it was the relief of a boy who wanted more than anything to be forgiven by his mother. "Of course, Mom," he said, "of course. Anything you want, I will take you anywhere you like." That night I placed a small recorder in my purse and I practiced. I practiced keeping my hands perfectly still on a table. I practiced letting my face go soft and tired and open. I stood in front of the mirror and I rehearsed my questions over and over until they came out sounding like a grieving mother's sorrow and not a nurse's careful precision, until each one sounded like something a woman would ask because she needed to hear it to heal, and not because she needed it on tape. It was the hardest performance of my life. I had never in 38 years lied to my son about anything that mattered, not once. And now I was going to sit across a small table from him and be from the first word to the last a lie. A soft and broken and forgiving lie, so that the truth could finally live. We met the next day at a quiet corner table in a half-empty restaurant, the kind of place with too much space between the tables, which was exactly why I had chosen it. And I let my son talk. I did not accuse him of anything. I did not weep, though the tears were near the whole time, and I could have called them up in a second if I had needed them. I folded my hands on the table and I looked at him with all the worn-out sorrow of a woman who only wants to understand so that she can finally rest, and I asked my careful questions and he answered them. He answered all of them easily now, almost eagerly relieved beyond measure, because he believed at last that we were on the same side of it, mother and son together, that the worst was behind us, and now we were only making sense of a sad thing together. I asked him when it had truly begun, and he told me. I asked how the money had been moved through which accounts and into which names, and he told me patient and gentle, explaining it to me the way you explain a hard thing to someone you love and want to spare. I asked who had signed the papers that ended a stranger's identity and gave his name to Walter's fake death, and he told me about the dentist Harold Vane by name. I asked where the insurance money had gone and whether there was anything at all left for me, and he explained the whole architecture of it, leaning in, lowering his voice, laying out for me every beam and joint of the thing his father had built, so that I would understand, so that his mother would understand and be at peace. There was one bad moment. A waiter came by too quickly and too quietly, and I had not heard him coming, and Bradley stopped mid-sentence, and for half a breath his eyes went sharp, and he glanced around the room, and I felt the whole thing teetering. And I did the only thing I could. I reached across the table and put my old hand over my son's hand, and I let my eyes fill honestly. It did not take any acting at all by then, and I said I just miss who I thought we were, Bradley. I just miss it so much. And the sharpness melted out of his face, and the guilt flooded back in, and he turned his hand over and held mine, and he never once looked at my purse, and he went on talking. He asked me one thing I had not prepared for, whether I hated him, whether I could ever forgive him, and I told him the truth, which was safest. I told him that he was my son, and that I would love him until the day I died. And that was true, and it was on the tape, and it did not save him. And both of those things have had to live in me ever since. When it was over, he paid the check, insisting, and he walked me out to my car in the parking lot, and he hugged me a long, hard hug, and he said into my hair, "I am so glad we can finally talk about this, Mom. I am so glad." And I said I was glad too. And I meant something so different by it than he did, that the two meanings could have been in two different languages. When it was done, I had everything. I had the false name and the real name. I had the mechanism of the fake death and the cold storage and the county road. I had the forged dental report and the bought dentist named on tape. I had the money and the accounts and the theft and the inheritance and the controlling interest signed over. And I had it all in my son's own voice, clear and unhurried and freely given, wanting to be understood. I had built the entire thing without breaking a single law out of my own hard knowledge of a body, my own lawful right to my own records, one careful and lawful investigator, and one recorded lunch with a son who thought he was comforting his mother. I took it all to a lawyer named Nora Whitman, whose name I had gotten carefully and quietly, a woman who did not handle wills or houses or divorces, but who handled fraud. Real fraud, the kind that ends in charges. She was younger than me by a good 20 years, sharp and spare and unsentimental, and she read through my folder without saying a single word, page by page, her face growing harder and stiller with each one. When she reached the end, she set the last page down and squared the stack and looked up at me across her desk. "Mrs. Boyd," she said, "what you have assembled here is a criminal conspiracy, identity fraud, insurance fraud, the unlawful handling and concealment of a human body, filing a false death, and your son is in it up to his neck by his own recorded words. This is not something you settle quietly. This is not something a family works out around a kitchen table. This goes to the district attorney." "Then take it there," I said. She warned me. It would not be fast, and she was right to warn me, because I think a part of me still imagined it might end in some single clean afternoon of justice. She told me that a case like this does not move in days or even weeks the way it does in stories. The district attorney's office would have to review everything. They would have to build probable cause on their own account, not just take mine. And to prove the central fact that the man in the grave was not my husband, they would need to open that grave, exhume the remains, and test them, and an exhumation is not a thing anyone does lightly. A judge would have to be persuaded to sign the order. Then a laboratory would take its own weeks to return a result. This, she told me, was not a lightning strike. It was a slow machine, and once it began to turn, it would grind forward on its own schedule, and could not be hurried, and could not once truly started be stopped. "I understand," I told her. And I did. I have watched slow and certain things arrive my whole working life. I have sat by a bed for 2 days, waiting for a breath that everyone knew was the last one. I know exactly how to wait for a thing that is certain to come but will not be rushed. "Start the machine, Miss Whitman. I will do the waiting." Nora Whitman filed the case, and then the weeks began exactly as she had promised they would. There was no thunderclap. There was no knock on a door at dawn, no dramatic reckoning, nothing at all, like the way I had let myself imagine it in the worst of my anger. There was only a slow, grinding official quiet that tested every ounce of patience I had built up across 40 years of waiting rooms and deathbeds. The office reviewed the evidence. They asked me to come in and go over it, and then to come in and go over it again, the same questions in slightly different order testing, whether my story stayed the same, which it did, because it was true. And true stories do not need to be remembered, they only needed to be told. I learned to sit in the hard chairs of government waiting rooms with my hands folded in my lap. I learned that the wheels of the law do not turn for a woman's grief or a woman's rage. They turn for probable cause, and probable cause is built one document and one sworn statement at a time, slowly by people who have seen a great many folders and are not moved by any single one. But it was building. I could feel it building the way you feel weather coming. The investigators who had powers. I did not have and never wanted powers, a private citizen, and her lawful investigator could not touch, went and got the things I had only been able to point at. They subpoenaed the bank records. I had never been able to open the accounts under the Gordon Hale name, and those records laid out in cold columns. Everything Bradley had confessed to me, across that restaurant table and more. The accounts opened decades ago under the false name. Nearly $2 million moved out of Boyd Freight over 20 years in amounts so small and so patient that no single year had ever looked wrong. Only the whole of them together, laid end to end, telling the truth. The larger transfers made in the weeks right before the fire, when Walter had been quietly emptying his own life into another man's name, getting ready to die on paper. The dental records were pulled, the real ones from Dr. Alan Pruitt's 30 years of files on 4th Street, and set beside the report, and examined by a real forensic odontologist the state brought in, who confirmed in plain professional language exactly what I had seen at my own oak table in one evening. The charts did not match the man they were supposed to belong to. Walter Boyd had a filling where the report claimed a crown. The identification was false. And Ruth Callahan gave her statement and named the real dentist and remembered driving a grumbling Walter to that 4th Street office years ago. One more small true thing laid into the growing weight of it. And then the hardest order of all came through, the one Nora Whitman had warned me would take the longest and be the heaviest. A judge, persuaded at last by the accumulated weight of the dental forgery and the bank records and the recorded confession, signed a warrant to exhume the body buried in the churchyard under my husband's name so that a laboratory could test with certainty who was truly lying there. I gave my consent as the surviving spouse, and it was a strange thing to sign a paper agreeing to open a grave I had wept over. On the morning they did it, I stood at a distance at the edge of the churchyard in the cold, and I did not weep, and I did not look away. I watched them lift the vault, and I did not think about Walter at all. I thought about the man inside it, whoever he had been, the forgotten man with the one estranged niece, and I made him a quiet promise across that distance, the same promise I had made 100 times over 100 beds. I told him silently that I was not going to let him go back into the ground under another man's name. I told him I knew he was in there, and that someone finally knew, and that it was going to be set right. It was the closest thing to prayer I had said in a long time. And while all of that ground slowly forward in offices and laboratories, Nora Whitman called me one afternoon with a strange, careful note in her voice that I had not heard from her before. "Mrs. Boyd," she said, "there is something in the insurance file that I think you need to come and see in person. I do not want to describe it to you over the phone." I drove to her office that same afternoon, and she slid a set of papers across her desk to me, and it was a life insurance policy. But it was not the one Bradley had told me about, the policy on Walter's life that he had rerouted to himself. This was a different policy entirely. This was a policy on my life, on me. And I recognized it slowly as I looked at it, because it was the one I had set aside in the filing cabinet without understanding the one I had told myself I would come back to. "I signed this," I said slowly, tracing my own signature at the bottom with one finger. "I remember signing this. It was more than 15 years ago now. Walter came to me one evening and said we ought to be sensible about our age, that we should each take out a policy, one on him and one on me, so that whichever of us went first, the other would be provided for and never have to worry. It seemed loving. It seemed responsible. I signed mine, and he signed his, and I never once thought about it again in 15 years. Why would I? It was just a sensible thing married people do." "Look at the ownership," Nora Whitman said quietly. "Not the signature, the ownership. And the beneficiary." I looked, and the floor of the world tilted slowly under me the way it had in the grocery store, the way it had outside the pale green house. Because I saw two things at once. The first was that although the policy was on my life, I was not its owner. Walter was. He had structured it so that he was the owner and the payer of the premiums, and I was only the insured, only the life the money was measured against. I had thought when I signed it that it was my policy, mine, and his ours. It was not. It was his, entirely his, a thing he owned that happened to be built out of my life. And because he was the owner and not I, he could do with it whatever he liked, and I would never have to be told, and I would never have to sign a thing. And the second thing I saw was what he had done with it. When I signed that paper 15 years ago, the money on my death was set to go to Walter, my husband, which had made all the sense in the world. But the name on the beneficiary line now was not Walter's. Somewhere along the way, quietly with the stroke of a pen, I never saw the beneficiary had been changed. If I died, the money on my life would not go to my husband. It would go to Bradley, to my son. And there was one more thing in that folder, and it was the coldest thing I have ever held in my two hands in a life spent holding cold things. It was a single sheet of paper in Walter's own handwriting. I knew that hand better than I knew my own 41 years of grocery lists and notes left on the counter, and cards signed at Christmas. It was a page of notes, and it was about me. It was my daily schedule. The mornings I went to the grocery store and which store. The route I took to get there. The mornings I visited the churchyard and roughly when. And there near the bottom in his plain block letters, the hour I took my heart medication every single night, and the dose. He had written down the private rhythms of my days, the small unwatched machinery of my life in his own hand, the way a hunter writes down the trails and the watering places and the hours a particular animal comes down to drink. I sat there in Nora Whitman's quiet office, and I felt the last piece drop into place, and it was colder than anything that had come before. It colder than the grocery store, colder than the pale green house, colder than my son weeping in the dark. Because I understood all at once and completely that the faked death had not been the end of the plan. It had only been the first half of it. Walter had made himself vanish. But I was still here, and as long as I was here, I was a loose thread, the one loose thread in the whole design, because I was the one person on earth who might someday stand in a grocery store aisle and know his face and his shoulders and his cough for what they were. which was exactly precisely what had happened. He could not simply leave that thread hanging forever, trusting to luck that his living wife would never once cross his path in a county they both still lived in. A dead man cannot inherit from a living wife, but a dead man could arrange quietly, patiently, through a son who was already in far too deep to say no for something to happen to that wife. Not soon, not in a way that would draw an eye, but someday. A fall on the stairs of a house she lived in alone, a slip in the garden, a mistake with the heart medication, whose dose and hour he had written down in his own hand on this page. An old woman living alone, everyone would have said, and shaken their heads, so sad she never really recovered after she lost her husband. Her heart just gave out one night, it happens. And then the money measured against my life would flow quietly to Bradley, and the last living witness to the entire scheme would be gone from the earth, and Walter and Sharon could grow old together under the wind chimes of the pale green house, and no one ever would know the truth of a single part of it. I read his notes again slowly, the whole page, my route to the store and my mornings at the churchyard and the hour of my medication, and I understood that I was not only the woman he had betrayed and buried in his own place and let grieve for 7 months. I was the woman he had been quietly, patiently preparing to erase from the world for good. The grief he had put me through was not even the whole of the cruelty. It was only the part that had already happened. I did not fall apart in that office. I have thought since about why I did not, and I believe it is because I had already days before done my last real crying over an old lake photograph, and there was simply nothing left in me to break. What I felt instead was a kind of terrible clarity, and inside the clarity, one clear thing I had to do that had nothing to do with courtrooms or charges or the slow machine of the law. There was a woman in that pale green house who did not know what I now knew. Sharon. She was living inside the same lie I had lived inside, only from the other side of it, and she was living inside it beside a man who had proven he would plan the quiet death of an inconvenient wife. And I could not let another person be kept in that dark the way I had been kept in it. Whatever else Sharon was to this story, she was not my enemy. She was the other woman he had lied to, and she had a right to the truth from a person, and not from a pair of police officers on her doorstep with a warrant. So I drove back to the quiet green-lined street one more time, and this time I did not park down the block. I did not wear a hat or sit low in the seat or watch from the shadows like a stranger. I parked directly in front of the pale green house in full afternoon light, and I walked up the path between the white pickets past the still wind chimes, and I rang the bell. It was Sharon who opened the door. She looked at me with the cautious, pleasant politeness you give a stranger on your step. No recognition in it, because of course she had never seen my face, only perhaps been told years ago that a wife existed once and was dead. "Can I help you?" she said. "I am here to see the man you know as Gordon," I said. "My name is Kathleen. There is something you need to know, and I would rather you heard it from me sitting in your own front room than from the police standing on this porch." Something in my face or in my steadiness must have reached her because she did not close the door on me. She hesitated, and then she stepped back and let me in. She led me into a small, tidy, lived-in living room. There were children's crayon drawings held to the refrigerator with magnets visible through the doorway to the kitchen. There was a plain wooden cross on one wall. There was a worn, comfortable sofa and a basket of folded laundry, and the ordinary warm clutter of a real family's real life. And I stood in the middle of it and understood that whatever else was true, this house had been a real home to real people, and that I was about to bring the roof down on it, and that I had no choice, and that Sharon had done nothing to deserve any of it either. She called out toward the back of the house, toward the yard, and a moment later he came in through the back door with his sleeves rolled up and garden dirt on his hands, and he saw me standing in the middle of Sharon's living room, and the color went straight out of his face, the way it had gone out of Bradley's in the dark car. "Kathleen," he whispered. I did not raise my voice. That is a thing I had promised myself on the drive over, that whatever happened in that room, I would not shout, because shouting is for people who have not already won. "Sit down, Sharon," I said gently, and something in my gentleness frightened her, more than shouting would have, and she sat slowly on the edge of the worn sofa without taking her eyes off the two of us. I turned to the man who had been my husband for 41 years. "I have documents in my car," I said to him. "Legal papers. Very soon, and it will be soon. Now other people are going to come to this house and read them to you, and put your hands behind your back. I did not want you to hear it first from them. And I wanted her," I said, tipping my head toward Sharon, "to hear the truth from a person who has no reason left to lie to her, instead of from a stranger with a badge." "What did you do?" he said hoarsely. To me, still after everything, What did you do as if I were the author of his ruin? I did not do anything, Walter, I said, and I used his real name, his true name the first time I had said it to his face since the store, and I watched it land on him. You did all of it. Every piece. I only found the truth that was already there, and I told it. That is the whole of what I did. I found it, and I told it. Sharon was looking between us, and I watched the confusion in her face begin to curdle slowly into a dread that came up from somewhere deep, from some place that had perhaps been uneasy for a long time without letting itself know why. Gordon, she said. Who is this woman? What is she talking about? I am his wife, I said to her plainly kindly, because she was owed plainness and kindness both. His legal wife. We were married 41 years. The man you have loved and lived beside for 20 years, the man who let you believe he was a widower alone in the world, does not exist. There is no Gordon Hale. His name is Walter Boyd. And he is not a widower, Sharon. He never was. He has a living wife. Me. I have been alive across the county this whole time, and 7 months ago, he arranged his own death so that I would believe he was gone, and I wore black and wept over a grave while he came home to you. The silence in that little room was the loudest thing I have ever heard in a lifetime spent in rooms where silence means everything. Is it true? Sharon said. Her voice had gone thin as paper, and she was not looking at me anymore. She was staring at him, at the man with the dirt still on his hands, with her whole face slowly coming apart at its seams. You told me you were alone. You told me your wife had passed years ago before we ever met, that you had grieved her and buried her and had no one left in the world. You cried when you told me. I held you while you cried about her. She was rising off the sofa now. 20 years. I gave that man 20 years of my life. My grandbabies call him Grandpa. He walked my daughter down the aisle when her own father would not. And the whole time, there was a woman across the county wearing his ring. He had someone, I said, and my voice was gentle now, because whatever anger I had left in me was not for her and never had been. He had me. And he told you that your rival was dead and buried and gone, and he told me that he himself was dead and buried and gone, and both of us put on black and wept for a lie he wrote for us. You are not my enemy, Sharon. Hear me on that. We were handed the very same story from opposite ends of it. He made fools of us both in the same breath for 20 years. She pressed her hand flat against her mouth. 20 years, she whispered again through her fingers. She turned back to him, and her voice cracked straight down the middle. Say something. Tell her she is wrong. Tell me she is a mad woman. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not do this to me. Tell me. Say something. He could not. That was the thing. That was the whole of it in the end. He opened his mouth and he closed it and he opened it again, and nothing came out because there was nothing that could come out. And in that silence, in his failure to say the single word that would have saved him in her eyes, Sharon learned everything she needed to know. She learned it the way I had learned it in the grocery store, not from words, but from the body, from the truth. From the truth the body tells when the mouth has run out of lies. He sank down onto the arm of the sofa as though his legs had simply stopped holding him. Kathleen, he said, and he was not looking at Sharon. Now he was looking at me, and there was something in his face I had not expected and did not want, which was that at last, too late, by decades too late, he had stopped performing. Kathleen, he said, I am not going to tell you I can explain it because I cannot. I have known for a long time what I am. It did not start as a plan. You have to believe that much, not for my sake, I have no sake left, but because it is the one true thing. It started as one cowardice. One single night I did not have the courage to end a thing I should have ended, and then I did not have the courage to tell you about it. And then I did not have the courage to undo any of it. And every year the not having courage grew a little bigger until it was a whole second house with people in it, and I could not find the door, and I was too much a coward to make one. And when it got too heavy to carry, I did not put it down like a man. I faked my own death and let you grieve me because that was easier than one honest conversation with my own wife. That is the whole of what I am, Kathleen. A coward who took the easy road so many times it led him here. And do you know it was the closest thing to honesty that man had given me in 20 years, and it changed nothing at all, and I found that I could hear it without it moving me the way you can hear rain when you are already inside and dry. No, I said to him, not cruelly, just finally. You have explained enough for a lifetime, Walter. You chose the lie 1,000 mornings in a row. You chose the theft slow and careful for 20 years. You chose to take a dying, forgotten man and use his body as a prop in your own funeral. You chose to let me kneel at that grave and claw the marble till my nails split. And I know now, though you have not mentioned it, And I notice you have not mentioned it, that you chose one thing more. One thing you wrote down in your own hand." He flinched at that, and I knew that he knew that I knew, and I did not say the rest of it aloud in front of Sharon, not yet, because there was something I needed from her first, and I would not poison the moment before I had it. He closed his eyes and did not answer, and his silence on that last point was its own confession. I turned to Sharon, who was standing in the middle of her own ruined living room with her arms wrapped around herself, and I saw in her exactly what I had seen in my own mirror the morning after the grocery store. A woman who had just learned that her whole life was built on the same lie mine was, and who did not yet know what to do with her own two hands. "I have to go now," I said as gently as I have ever said anything to a dying patient. "But before I do, Sharon, I want you to understand that you and I are the same in this. Neither of us did anything but love a man and believe him. Neither of us has a single thing to be ashamed of. The shame in this room belongs entirely to him." And then Sharon did a thing I had not expected, a thing that changed the last shape of everything. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, and then she turned and walked stiffly out of the room down the hall, and I heard a drawer open somewhere in the back of the house, and she came back holding a folder in her two shaking hands, and she held it out to me. "I found this months ago," she said, her voice breaking on every few words. "In the back of a drawer in his side of the closet that he keeps locked. I did not go looking, a key had fallen, and I was putting things right, and it was there, and I opened it, and I did not understand what I was looking at, so I put it back, and I told myself it was nothing, insurance paperwork, boring grown-up nonsense. But I never quite forgot it. Take it. If it is what I am afraid it is, you should have it, not me." I took the folder and I opened it, and inside in another copy was the policy on my life with Bradley's name on the beneficiary line where Walter's used to be, and beneath it another copy of that page of notes in Walter's own hand, my route and my churchyard mornings and the dose and the hour of my heart medication. Sharon had been living for months beside the plain evidence of my planned death, folded in a locked drawer 6 feet from where her grandchildren slept, and had not known what it was. And now, watching my face as I read it, she knew. I watched her come to understand all at once what the papers were, what her Gordon had been quietly preparing to do to another woman, and I watched the last of whatever loyalty had ever tied her to him burn away to nothing right there in front of me. She looked at him, at the man on the arm of the sofa with the dirt on his hands, and she looked at him the way you look at a stranger who has been living in your house wearing the face of someone you loved. "You were going to kill his wife," she said to him, and it was not a question, and her voice was very quiet and very final. "You were going to have that boy kill her. And you kept the plan for it in our house, behind the coats, next to the children." I did not answer that either. He had no answers left for anyone. Whatever loyalty might once have kept Sharon silent, whatever a lesser woman might have done to protect the wreck of her own 20 years, it was gone now, and it was gone for good. And I understood, without either of us saying it aloud, that Sharon had in the space of a few minutes in her own living room become a witness. She had handed me the folder freely. She had heard him fail to deny it. He had made a victim of her too, the deepest kind, had done it under her own roof and beside her own grandchildren while planning to have another woman quietly killed, and she was not going to lift one finger to save him from any of it now. "I have to go," I said again. I gathered the folder against my chest and I walked toward the door. "Kathleen," he called after me from the arm of the sofa, and his voice cracked clean in half on my name. "For the years we had, for what we were. Please." I stopped. I did not turn around. I stood there in the doorway of the pale green house with the folder held against me, and I said the truest thing I had, the thing I had come to over all those long nights at the oak table. "What we were was real to me," I said. "Every single day of it, Walter, even the days you were already gone. That is exactly why you will never understand what you destroyed. A man who thought it was nothing could walk away from it lightly. I cannot and I never will, and that is the whole difference between us, and it always was." And then I heard it faint at first, and growing louder down the length of the quiet green street. Sirens. The slow machine had at last finished its turning. All those weeks of documents and waiting rooms and subpoenas and one opened grave and one laboratory doing its patient work had built themselves out of sight into this single ordinary afternoon, and the afternoon had arrived entirely on its own schedule, and not on mine the way I had known it would. The warrants had come through. 2 cars turned onto the lane and slowed in front of the pale green house with the white picket fence and the still wind chimes and doors opened. Walter looked at me one last time from where he sat, and there was no anger in his face and there was not even fear anymore, and there was not any of the performance left. There was only the hollow, emptied look of a man watching a thing he had spent 20 years building come down around him all at once, and understanding far too late to matter that he had built the whole of it on sand, and that sand does not hold and never did and was never going to. I walked out to my car and I got in, and I did not look back while they came up the path between the pickets. I did not watch them put his hands behind him. I did not need to see it. I had already seen the only face of his that mattered months before in the bright canned goods aisle, when he looked his own wife dead in the eye and said gently, kindly, "I do not know you." A man can only break your heart all the way once with a sentence like that. Everything after it, the sirens and the warrants and the years of proceedings still to come, all of it is only paperwork. I want to tell you that the ending was clean and quick and satisfying, that there was a single bright moment where the scales came down even, and I felt the whole weight of it lift. But the truth is that justice moves, like everything else I have known in this life, slowly and with a great deal of paperwork, and it does not care at all about your need for a clean ending. Walter did not collapse dramatically in a courtroom. He was arrested and charged and held, and then the long grinding process of the law began in earnest, and went on for a long time. Identity fraud, insurance fraud, the unlawful handling and concealment of a corpse, filing a false instrument, conspiracy. And once the policy on my life and the page of notes in his own hand were entered into it, the graver matter still the thing those documents pointed at, which the lawyers argued over in language far more careful than the plain truth of it, but which everyone in the room understood. The exhumation went forward, and the laboratory took its patient weeks, and when the results came back at last, they confirmed with the cold certainty of science the thing I had known standing in the grocery store with a jar of sauce going warm in my numb hand. The man buried under my husband's name was not my husband. He was the poor, forgotten soul Walter had befriended and used, a homeless man with a terminal illness and one estranged niece 3 states away who had died alone and of natural causes in his sleep, and then been robbed even in death, even of the one last thing he had left, which was his own name over his own grave. That part sat with me longer than any of the rest of it, longer than Walter, longer even than Bradley. Because for 40 years I had sat beside people as they died, rich ones and poor ones surrounded by loving families, and ones entirely alone in the world. And across all those years and all those beds I had come to believe one simple thing above every other thing I believed. Everyone deserves to leave this world with their own name on them, and someone to say it out loud. That is the whole of my faith if I have one. That is what 40 years taught me. And Walter had taken a dying man who had already lost everything a person can lose, and had stolen from him the one last thing he had his own name over his own grave, and had done it so casually as a matter of logistics, a solved problem, a body procured and stored and staged. It was of all the things Walter did the one I found I could not forgive, not because it was done to me, but because it was done to a man who had no one to be angry on his behalf. So when the case had run far enough along to allow it, I did the one thing left that I could do, and it had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with 40 years of watching people die. I found the man's niece, the estranged one, living 3 states away, and I made the phone call. It was a hard call to make to a stranger about an uncle she had not spoken to in years, and had assumed when she thought of him at all was simply gone somewhere into the world. I told her who I was and what had been done, all of it, the shelter and the illness and the friendship that was not a friendship, and the fire and the false name over his grave. And she wept on the phone with a woman she had never met for an uncle she had half forgotten. And I understood those tears because they were the tears you cry when you learn too late that you should have gone looking sooner. And then together, the 2 of us, we arranged for him to be laid to rest properly, under his own name, with a small plain stone that told the simple truth of who he was and when he had lived and died. I stood at that second quieter graveside with his niece beside me on a gray morning, not unlike the one where all of this began, and when the small service was done, I said his name out loud once clearly into the cold air, so that it had been said, so that a name had gone over that grave that belonged there. And I felt something in my chest come loose that had been clenched tight as a fist for the better part of a year. It was the closest thing to peace I found in the whole long ordeal, and it had not one thing to do with Walter or Bradley or courtrooms or money. It was just an old hospice nurse doing the last thing she truly knew how to do, which is to send a forgotten person out of this world with his own name intact and someone standing there to say it. Bradley took a plea. His lawyers and the district attorney reached an agreement, and my son went to prison for fraud and forgery and his part in the conspiracy. not for the rest of his life, but long enough to sit alone with what he had done, which was the thing I found I most needed for him, not vengeance, but that he would have the years and the silence to truly understand it. When the matter of the insurance policy on my life came fully to light, the one with his name on the line where mine used to be, and the notes on my daily schedule in his father's hand, something in my son seemed to finally break in the right direction, the way a badly set bone sometimes has to be broken again to heal straight. I do not believe I have to tell you that Bradley ever meant to be the hand that harmed me. I have turned it over 10,000 times, and I have to believe that, or I could not go on being his mother, and I have chosen to go on being his mother. I think he told himself the whole way down that he was only handling money, only keeping a hard secret, only managing his fragile old mother's comfort from a careful distance. I think it was not until that policy and those notes came out into the light that my son understood what his father had actually been building underneath the part Bradley thought he understood, and that Bradley had been holding the ladder steady for it the entire time without letting himself look up at what was being built at the top. I saw him once before he went in to serve his sentence. It was not a reconciliation, and I will not dress it up as one, because I did not have a reconciliation in me, and I will not pretend to a peace I did not feel. We sat across from each other with a pane of scratched glass between us, and neither of us seemed to know where to put our hands or our eyes. "I love you," I told him through the glass. "I will always love you because you are my son, and I carried you, and I sat up with your fevers, and there is no undoing that, and I would not undo it if I could. But love does not erase what you did to me. Both of those things are true at the very same time, and they are going to have to live in the same room for the rest of both our lives. You are the one who taught me that this year. That love and consequence can sit in the same room, and neither one cancels the other. I did not know that a year ago. I know it now." He nodded. And for the first time in the whole terrible ordeal, he did not argue, and he did not explain, and he did not reach for a reason or a justification or a plea for me to understand. He only lowered his head and he cried quietly the way a boy cries when he has finally run all the way out of places to hide and knows it. And I let him. And then I stood up and I put my hand flat against the cold glass for a moment, just a moment, the closest I could come to touching my son. And then I took my hand back and I turned and I left, and I did not look back because I could not and because he needed to begin, and so did I. The Gordon Hale identity was formally invalidated and struck from every record it had wormed its way into over 20 years. The accounts were frozen and traced and unwound. The money Walter had stolen from Boyd Freight across 2 decades, the money he had hidden and moved and stored a dead man's name to protect, was recovered by the court dollar by patient dollar and returned to where it belonged. What had been stolen came back. It always takes far longer than it should, and it never comes back whole, and some of it is gone forever into fees and time and the wearing down of a person. But the bones of it came back, and Boyd Freight, which after all had employed honest men like Roy Dillard for decades, was made whole enough to go on. And Roy Dillard, the old driver, Bradley had steered away from me at the graveside with a hand on his shoulder. I went and found him too, once it was all far enough along. I sat in his kitchen and I let him tell me finally the thing he had come to the funeral to tell me and been turned away from telling. He had noticed over his last few years driving for the company that the numbers on his runs did not add up, that money and routes and freight did not quite reconcile the way they should, and he had not known what it meant, only that something was wrong, and he had come to the funeral, half meaning to warn me that Walter's business affairs were not what they seemed. And he had been gently walked away from me, and had told himself afterward that he was a foolish old man imagining things at a funeral. I told him he had not been imagining anything. I told him he had seen true and been right, and I thanked him, and I watched an old man set down a weight he had carried for over a year, the weight of having tried to warn someone and been turned aside, and having wondered ever since if he should have tried harder. "You tried," I told him. "You were the only one who tried. It is not your fault they were better at hiding it than you were at seeing it." Not many people get to hear that they were right all along about a thing everyone told them to forget. I was glad I could be the one to tell him. Sharon and I spoke one last time after all of it was over, or as over as such a thing ever gets. It was an awkward and painful conversation between 2 women who had loved the same man and been lied to by the same mouth, and there was no map for it, because who has ever taught 2 women how to speak to each other across a thing like that? I did not forgive her because I found there was nothing in her for me to forgive. She had been deceived as thoroughly and as cruelly as I had, and had lost her 20 years the same way I had lost my 41, all at once and after the fact. And I did not hate her, because hatred needs a target that has wronged you. And Sharon had not wronged me. Walter had wronged us both with the same hands. We were two women who had been standing at opposite ends of the same long lie for 2 decades, without ever knowing the other was there. When she thanked me quietly for coming to her door myself, instead of letting the police be the ones to bring her whole life down in front of her grandchildren, I understood her completely, and I believe she understood me. We did not become friends. There was too much wreckage between us for that, and neither of us pretended otherwise. But we parted in something that was not quite peace, and not quite grief, and not quite forgiveness. Something with no name, I know, but something more honest than any of those two survivors of the same disaster, nodding to each other once across the rubble, before walking off in different directions to rebuild. My husband was named Walter Boyd, and he is in prison now, an old man facing the long remainder of the proceedings and the years, and I do not spend my nights thinking about him anymore. That of everything surprised me the most. I had been so sure the anger would live in me forever, that it would be the last companion I had, that I would carry it to my own grave. It did not stay. It burned itself down slowly over the months, from a wildfire to a low, steady flame, to embers, to a cold, clean hearth, and when the last of it had gone out, what was left underneath? To my great surprise, was not a hole. What was left was simply me. Just me, Kathleen, the woman who had been there underneath all of it the whole time, waiting. There is a thing I have thought about often in the quiet months since, and I will set it down here because it is perhaps the closest I have come to understanding any of it. People asked me in the aftermath, once it was all known, how I had done it. How a woman my age, a nurse who had never so much as parked outside a stranger's house in her life, had built a case that put 2 men away and unwound 20 years of careful crime. They asked it as though I had done something extraordinary, and I never knew how to answer, because from the inside it did not feel extraordinary at all. It felt like the only thing I knew how to do. 40 years at the bedsides of the dying does not teach you to be clever or to be brave in the way people mean when they say brave. It teaches you something plainer and harder than either. It teaches you to look at the thing that is actually in front of you, and not the thing you wish were there, or fear is there, or have been told is there. Every family I ever sat with wanted me to tell them their person had more time, and every time I could not, I had to look at the body and tell them the truth instead, gently but the truth. That is the whole of the skill. It is not a gift, it is a discipline, and it is a lonely one, and I had practiced it 10,000 times before I ever stood in that grocery aisle. When the moment came, my whole life had already been rehearsing me for it without my knowing. I did not rise to the occasion. The occasion simply arrived and found me already made for it, the way a key arrives at last, at the lock it was cut for years before in the dark, by hands that did not know what door it would someday open. Months have passed now, more than a year all told, since a cough in a grocery store aisle. The house feels different than it did, lighter. I redecorated it, not in a rage, not to scorch away the memories, but slowly and with care, to make the space finally and fully my own, to put my own hand on every room. I took up hobbies I had set down decades ago quietly, without noticing, for the sake of a marriage that turned out to have been half a fiction, even as I lived it. I travel now a little with Ruth and with a few other friends who never once in the worst of it doubted me when I said I had seen my dead husband alive in a store. I laugh, and I have stopped feeling guilty when I do. I sleep through the night in the middle of the bed, not because I trained myself to, but because the middle of the bed is simply where I sleep now, and the edge is a country I have left. Grief did not destroy me in the end, though. For 7 months I was certain it would. It was not grief that nearly finished me. It was silence. The silence I was kept inside, and very nearly kept inside, forever. And the truth, ugly and slow and expensive as it turned out to be, costing me my husband and my son and the whole shape of the life I thought I had lived, the truth is the thing that gave me back my own life. I would make the same trade again. I have thought about it, and I would. One gray afternoon not long ago, I drove out to the churchyard, to the plot where a stranger had lain for 7 months under a lie. The stone has been corrected now. The false name is gone from it. I stood there for a little while in the cold, and I want to be clear about why, because it matters. I did not stand there to mourn my husband because my husband is alive in a cell and does not have my mourning and will not get it. And I did not stand there to mourn the poor forgotten man, because he rests now 3 states over under his own true name in a place his niece can visit and does. I stood at that corrected grave to say goodbye to someone else entirely. To the woman I used to be. The one who clawed the marble until her nails split for a man who was 2 towns over teaching a child to ride a bicycle. The one who cried into an empty pillow for 7 months and begged a lie to come home to her. The one who mistook silence for loyalty and loyalty for love, and a closed casket for a kindness. That grave never held my husband, not for one single day. It held my innocence. It held everything I used to believe about the man I married and the son I raised and the 41 years I thought I understood down to the ground. And I stood there and I said goodbye to all of it, and to her, that trusting woman, kindly, the way you say goodbye to someone you loved who is truly gone. And then I left. And I did not look back, and I have not gone back since, and I do not think I will need to. Today my life is quieter than it was, smaller in some ways than the life I thought I had, but stronger in every single way that has ever actually mattered. I no longer confuse loyalty with the slow erasing of myself. I no longer believe that love asks a woman to keep her eyes closed to what is plainly in front of her. I learned at 63 years old, after a whole life of thinking I already knew it, that dignity is not a thing that is handed to you by a marriage or by blood or by anyone's good opinion. It is a thing you claim for yourself in the exact moment you decide that you will not be lied to for one single day more. And I learned that even after betrayal, even after a lifetime of the most careful deception, even standing in a spreading puddle of broken glass, while strangers around you whisper that you have finally lost your mind, it is never ever too late to trust what you know and to choose yourself. That choice changed everything. It cost me nearly everything, and it gave me back the one thing I had lost without ever knowing I had lost it, which was myself, and I would not undo it, and I would not trade it back, and that in the end, after all of it, is the whole